Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to Astrology for the Dead, the latest evolutionary astrology Zoom meeting. My name is Anthony Picco, and the way this topic, it's not as bad as it sounds. I just got a little dramatic with it. A couple of years ago, I was looking at the painter Vermeer, who was one of my favorite painters, and I thought to myself, but it's funny. He was basically unknown in his lifetime. As a matter of fact, after he died, his wife had to paint other people's names on his paintings to even sell them. And 200 years later, somebody starts noticing in the middle of the 1800s that, hey, who is this guy? And the next thing you know, he's become famous, and now he's considered one of the greatest painters that ever lived, but he can't get arrested back in the 1600s. So I thought, well, that's interesting. Let me see if something's going on with his chart. Well, a couple of hundred years later, it was a dead end because we don't know when he was born. We only know what month he was born. So we don't know if he's a Libra or a Scorpio or what he is. So that was a dead end. But at the same time, I was reading Hamilton, the biography by Ron Chernow. And Hamilton is quite an exceptional person. And I'm fond of him because I'm a Capricorn and he's a Capricorn. And of course, he's wonderful. And I noticed that he was a major character in the founding of America. He basically set up our entire banking and monetary system, which, when you think about America, is pretty huge because we run on money here more than anything else. Pardon my cynicism. But he's been kind of forgotten over the years. But then suddenly this biography comes out, and within a year or two, suddenly there's a hip hop rap musical on Broadway that's breaking all the records, and Hamilton is back in being famous again. And again, I thought to myself, something must be going on his chart. Even though he died, I wonder if there's some sort of transits. So I casually mentioned it to Elizabeth Grace, who is a wonderful astrologer who was going to be on my radio show. We were talking about it. And she said, hey, I did a lecture on that, a talk on that just 2 years ago. So I got her on the show. And I want to make a point. I owe a lot of this inspiration to Elizabeth Grace, and so I want to give credit where credit's due. There's her website. She's a wonderful astrologist. She got into astrology because she was she worked in the news biz, and she started noticing the planets and the news cycle kind of coalesced and matched each other up. She's also a wonderful personal astrologer and horary astrologer, but she knows her stuff. And if you are particularly interested in the lecture she gave that inspired me, you can go to The Horoscope Lives Forever. The article is at the link below, astro.com. And there's 2 interviews on air. The first one, she's on omtimes.com, internet radio. And the bottom one is the link to my archive of her and I talking about The Horoscope Lives Forever, or, Astrology for the Dead. So, I give my homage to Elizabeth. I see she's listening. I'm honored and flattered, but let's get on with this before my head gets too swelled. Emily Dickinson. Okay, if you don't know who Emily Dickinson is, real quickly, she's a well-renowned poet. She lived from 1830 to 1886. She never published any of her poetry during her lifetime except 6 or maybe 8 poems that were published anonymously, and not so her name was never out there. And when they did discover her, they relegated her to the American woman ghetto known as spinsterhood. She was the spinster poet who never got married, lived home all her life, yada yada yada, and her poetry was published and made known. So what happened later on? Well, let's start with her natal chart. Basic stuff here. First thing that's interesting, given we're waiting for her to become famous after she's dead, is Saturn is on her midheaven in her natal chart. This is pretty accurate data. It's taken from, I think, the Family Bible, and it was verified. So 4:40 a.m. is essentially when she's born. It's considered accurate. Saturn is on her midheaven. It's in Virgo, so is her north node on the midheaven conjunct Saturn. So this suggests a delay to her career and a delay to her life path, which is what I think of as the north node. Saturn doesn't delay just because it's mean, spirited. Saturn delays because it's waiting for you to be ready. So if you've matured at 12 years old, Saturn says, fine, you're ready. If you're 65 and you're still not mature, Saturn says you ain't getting it yet. So for whatever reason, she did not apparently reach Saturn's level of, acceptability for public poetry. Okay. Next, look down over the second house. We've got Venus conjunct the Sun, conjunct Mercury, all of them in Sagittarius. But Venus and Mercury conjunct give you a silver tongue. You know how to speak well. You know how to speak well, poetically, charmingly. Conjunct your Sun, it's a natural part of who you are. And it's straddling first and second house. Just to mention, I'm using Alcibiades in all of these charts, just telling you what it is. And so you've got this first house, second house quality, a skill, ability to speak poetically. Scorpio rising, again, a certain amount of a hidden quality to her, but her communications, down you go into Aquarius, and yet Uranus and Aquarius in the third house, how we speak and how we communicate. And so she's breaking ground in some way. Now that's her poetic stuff. I do want to make a side comment, which has nothing to do with what I'm going to talk about, but it's a juicy and scandalous thing, so I'm sure everybody will love it. She was considered to be this little spinster who didn't have a life. Later scholarship has turned up that there's a very good possibility that if she wasn't a lesbian, she was probably bisexual and was having a pretty good time with some of the neighbors. So well, I just mentioned that because if you look over in her fifth house, Mars is conjunct Pluto in Aries. Talk about a ramped up kind of sexuality. It's in the fifth house of sex for fun. If you don't know, sex in the eighth house is for procreation. Sex in the fifth house is to have fun with, to be romantic with. So clearly, and it's sextile in her Uranus. So clearly she wasn't quite this mousy little spinster that everybody seems to think she is. But that's how we used to create ghettos for American women back in the 20th century. So first chart that's interesting, the year, about 2 years after she dies, her relatives, I believe her brother-in-law, publishes a book of her poetry. And well, the first thing I'm noticing is Saturn. She's just passed her Saturn return, her second Saturn return. What's interesting about this is clearly the book was being created before. It's not like he suddenly published the book the same moment. It was published in November. I don't have a precise publication date, so I picked November 15th. But Saturn clearly in the past year had been on her midheaven and on her Saturn and on her North Node. So there's this, Saturn is coming along to set the record straight, and her relatives published the book. Her relatives, that's right, look down in the third house of siblings, immediate siblings and connections, and maybe even cousins or brothers-in-law. And you've got Jupiter and Mars sitting on her Uranus down in the third house of communications. So her siblings and her immediate relatives are energized, expanding her Uranus, expanding her Mars, and she becomes relatively well known. At the time, her book, published in November of 1890, went through 11 printings in 2 years, which is pretty hot stuff for a poet back in the 1890s. And the other thing to note, of course, is the North Node by transit is opposite, almost exactly opposite her Venus, and the North Node, as you know, goes backwards, so it was opposite her Sun and Mercury over the course of the previous few months. So a couple of years after she died, suddenly she's all the rage, and she's a big popular poet and well known with her poetry. However, what nobody really knows is that they messed with her poetry when they published it. So let's go to the next chart. This is July 1st, 1955. I'm picking the middle of the year because I don't have an exact date of a book publication, but in 1955, that's 65 or more years after she died, another book is published by a scholarly edition that went back to look over her private papers and said, wait a minute, this isn't her poetry. It's been radically edited. So this book restores her poetry to the way it's, quotes, supposed to be. What they did is they had capitalized stuff. They gave titles to things. They just adjusted it to fit, I think, the 1890s better. But the truth is, Emily Dickinson was a little more forward-thinking than you thought, and her poetry was a little unusual for the time. So what have we got going here? Now, this is the middle of the year, so I'm taking the outer transits loosely, but clearly look at Pluto. Where is it now? It's on her midheaven. She is, her career, it's going to be on her Saturn in 1955, and eventually, probably by the next year or earlier, it's going to be on her North Node. Pluto, rebirth, death and rebirth. Suddenly her public image has been reborn. because it's showing the world that, no, the poetry is actually like this. This is what she really wrote. And suddenly we have an Emily Dickinson that's the genuine object. So let's look over at the ascendant. Saturn is on her ascendant. Again, it's the middle of the year. It's going to be wobbling back and forth. Actually, it's retrograde right here. So we're clearly getting, a correction to her public image. And it's not the 10th house public image, but it's the way she presents herself to the world, her personal image. And Saturn is there correcting the way it's supposed to be, while Pluto is giving her kind of a rebirth. At the same time, transiting Neptune is crossing over her moon. And I didn't mention this, sorry, on the natal chart, but she's got Jupiter conjunct Neptune. You're not going to find a more poetic combination than expanding Neptune. Poetry is not the most linear of writing, so you're looking more in a Neptunian creative way, and Jupiter's expanding it. So now Neptune is squaring its own Neptune place along with the moon, and there's a bit of a kind of a Neptunian kind of explosions going on there. Also, Uranus and Mars, well, Uranus more, because this is the middle of the year chart, is in late Cancer, and you look over on the other side, and there is Neptune and Jupiter also in somewhat late Capricorn. So you're getting this Uranus zap from the other side by transit. So quite clearly, her reputation is restored and back to normal, and back to what it should be by a chart transit 65 years after she died. So that's interesting in and of itself. The next one I'm going to get into is going to be a few more charts, and is a little more interesting in terms of what happens chart-wise. We're talking about Vivian Mayer, who was born in 1926 and died in 2009. If you do not know who Vivian Mayer is, by all rights, Google her name. She is a phenomenal photographer and completely unknown during her lifetime. She worked as a nanny for most of her life. Actually, she was born in New York, but spent her life half in France and half back in New York because her mother was French. The father disappeared. They were going back and forth. She found work as a nanny. She found work that a live-in nanny. And what she would do in her spare time is take photographs and take photographs and take photographs and take photographs. Sometimes when she was with the children, she would take photographs. As a matter of fact, they have interviewed children that she nannied, and some of them said she was absolutely wonderful and kind of wacky and weird in a Mary Poppins kind of a way. And some of them actually said, actually, she was frightening to us because she would take us into neighborhoods that we were terrified of to take photographs while she was escorting us around. So theoretically, you could say she put the children at risk, but no damage has ever happened. She stayed in a lot of places. They let her keep her photography in her room as it began to pile up and pile up. So let's take a look at her chart. This is dirty data. All I have is her birthday. So this is a noon chart. So we're going to have to work with that. Okay. First thing I noticed right off the bat, the moon, of course, is the one we're going to be a little questionable about because we don't know when her exact birth time is. But 6 hours in either direction, the moon is still part of a strong T-square. Uranus is opposite the moon and is squaring Mars. Unusual behavior, Uranus opposite Mars, sometimes upsetting people, emotionally unusual, kind of an odd person, which she was documented as being, certainly not run-of-the-mill, and a peculiar kind of a quality to her. Excuse me. And there's another T-square showing Venus is opposite Neptune, kind of wonderful for a creative person, but it can be a little difficult. It's an opposition. It pulls her in opposite directions from the Neptune to the Venus. The Venus is retro. It's in Aquarius, which isn't even the most comfortable place for Venus. And it's forming a T-square with Saturn. So Saturn is kind of restricting her creative expression. Saturn square Venus is often an indicator of somebody who thinks of relationships as chores, as responsibilities. So there she is, being a nanny, being responsible for other people, and being a bit odd and a bit strange. The thing that's interesting that connects these T-squares, one, Saturn is trining Uranus. Whenever you see Saturn trining Uranus, there's this wonderful kind of quality of people who bring us into the future. They have the Saturn respect for the past, and but the Uranus thing is like, let's try something new. So Saturn kind of reins in Uranus. Uranus kind of keeps Saturn from sitting there and being an old fuddy-duddy. So in the middle of these two T-squares, you've got this kind of connection from the past to the future. And the other connection to the T-squares is Neptune is trining Mars, which suggests really quality spiritual action. Ideally, a person who has Neptune trine Mars is spiritual action, graceful action, intuitive action, which is certainly good for any kind of an artist. And Mars is sextiling Venus anyway. So we've got a nice connection between action and art. Okay. So the first chart, let me just check my notes here. Okay. The first chart I have is, she's still alive at this point. It's 2007. But the last number of years of her life, she was not doing particularly well financially. One of her previous employees actually paid for her apartment somewhere. But in 2007, she could no longer afford to pay her storage fees. And in July, sometime in 2007, all of her photographs were auctioned off. While she's still alive, but she's not particularly well. 2 years before she died, she failed to keep up payments in the storage space in Chicago's North Side. Her negatives, her prints, her audio recordings, and her 8mm films were auctioned off. 3 photo collectors bought parts of her work: John Maloof, Ron Slattery, Randy Prow. So she lost it. And what's interesting here is Neptune is on her Venus, and Saturn is on her Neptune. So she's getting Venus opposite Saturn, Neptune opposite Saturn, excuse me, on that Venus opposite Neptune, a strong spirituality. But Saturn is taking away her Neptunian qualities at the bottom, and not really the bottom, it's not a accurate chart, it's a noon chart. And up top visually, we see Neptune on her Venus kind of dissolving her art. It's spread to the winds as far as she's concerned. And also, Uranus is approaching Uranus return. It's not quite there yet, but it is getting close to it. And this is, again, middle of the year chart, July 1st. I'm not sure when the exact auction took place. I believe it was July, but I can't swear exactly when it was. And so you see her losing the artwork. Pluto is kind of passed from Mars, so I'm not too worried about that. But there, it's being taken away from her. She's still alive, so she's not dead yet. A year later, she's still alive, and John, let me see which name it is here. Slattery actually puts some of her photographs up on the internet in July 2008, which is what this chart is for. I picked mid-July, but it doesn't really, little response turns up. So Neptune is still on her Venus, but if you look at the bottom, Saturn and Mars have moved away from it. Okay, so whatever, the denial is kind of gone, but there's still this fogginess. I mean, she gets put up on the internet. Who the hell's going to look for her stuff? And this is actually when her Uranus conjunction is right on target. Uranus is at 22.5 degrees in this particular chart, and her Uranus is at 23 degrees. So still some sort of disruption. Uranus return should be about really kind of declaring your individuality, but she's not participating in it. So, but her stuff does get up, and those people in the know are noticing her work. I know I picked up on it at the time, but I'm already, I'm a graphic designer and an illustrator, and I'm into all this kind of stuff. So I'm always looking for stuff like this, but in general, it wasn't as big as it could have been. So what happens next in terms of her post-death fame is in September 2013, a movie is produced, a documentary on her life. And I picked, let me just check. Yes, I picked the 9th of September 2013 because that's the first time the documentary is shown at in public at, I believe, a Canadian film festival, but that's the first time it appears before the world. So what's happening in that particular day is Mars is directly opposite her sun. Action is being taken to promote her from someone else outside. It's pushing her forward. Uranus is at 12 degrees Aries, which is sextiling her sun, so it's bringing some of the individuality out, and kind of getting her out there. Now she's kind of known. People are clamoring for more Vivian Mayer, and Saturn is late, and Saturn is, where am I? Yeah, Saturn is sextiling her own natal Uranus. It's not quite as, wait, is that right? No, I'm sorry. My apologies. My notes are a little messy here. 12 degrees. Saturn is squaring her sun, so it's bringing some official recognition to her, but it's from a documentary. She's long gone. She's not getting, well, maybe she's getting what she needs on the other side, but not as far as I can tell. But now she's out there and she's being famous. To give you an idea of what Vivian Mayer did privately in her spare time, John Maloof has the majority of her work. He thinks he has about 90% of her output. This includes 100,000 to 150,000 negatives, more than 3,000 prints that she made, hundreds of rolls of film, home movies, audio tape interviews, and other ephemera, including cameras and paperwork. And he claims that he represents roughly 90% of her output. 150,000 negatives. Divide that, and you've got like 20,000 rolls of film that she took in her spare time while watching children, and she managed to develop and print 3,000 prints and never showed them to anybody. Maybe that's the Saturn T-square with the Venus opposite Neptune. I don't know. We don't have a rising sign for her. But all is not happy in Vivian Mayer land, because in June of 2014, a distant relative in France said, "Oh, no, that's mine. I'm her. All of her photographs should be mine," and is suing to claim ownership of them. I assume to get a payout there. Pluto, good old Pluto, is at 13 degrees Capricorn, directly opposite her natal Pluto at 13 degrees Cancer. So we're getting a power struggle of ownership and domination from France. It will be a problem because French law and American law are not the same. This is the kind of case that can go on for ages. And the sun that particular day, it is opposite her. I know the lawsuit was filed in June. I don't know exactly what day, but the sun is opposite her Mars. So again, there's this kind of energy, an opposition of a battle going on. And we don't know how it will end up. But there you go. The chart she has a chart right about the time of her death. Then after her death, things start happening. And here she is, famous. Believe me, please, if you like good photography, check out, find her name. It's gorgeous stuff. It's amazing photography. And it was kept in a closet for 50 years. Let's see who we have coming up next. This is going to be a little quicker. This is a shorter one. Alan Turing, 1912 to 1954. He is a very well-renowned individual in his particular field. He started out doing, I think the word is cryptography. He was a code breaker. He worked through codes. He figured out how to, break down codes. He was very popular in World War II to figure out what was going on and what the Nazis were saying, et cetera, all that kind of good stuff. And but that's not really what this chart is about. This particular part of the chat is about his unfortunate, the fact that he was unfortunately homosexual. And not that there's anything unfortunate about being homosexual, but it's not a good thing to be in 1950s England, okay? And we'll get to that in a second, but I do want to mention, by the way, he was also considered really the father of modern computing, not commuting, excuse me. He's really the Turing computation machine or something is something he created. It wasn't a computer, but it was beginning with the concepts of the base underline of what a computer was. And he's, as I said, considered the father of computing. And here is his birth chart. His birth chart is very accurate. It's I think it gets a AAA rating from Lois Rodden. If you don't know who Lois Rodden is, she's a wonderful astrologist who's published a number of books and has also been very seminal in learning how to create ratings for the qualification of birth data for astrology charts. So this is allegedly right on target. And well, the first thing we're seeing right off the bat, there's hardly any aspects, but one of the most powerful ones right up top, Uranus, is on his midheaven in Aquarius. So of course he's a groundbreaking kind of intellectual type, and it's trining Saturn, as we learned in the last chart. Saturn trining Uranus is somebody who brings us into the future by holding on to the things from the past that matter and being willing to experiment and try new things. Uranus, what does it do? It rules computers. It rules cryptography. It rules codes. All the kind of stuff that he was into is right there on his midheaven, and that's how he made his career. And then we look over in the second house, and now we're seeing some personal issues going on. Venus is conjunct Pluto. Pluto is conjunct the sun. Venus conjunct Pluto does suggest someone who can be very dominating or dominated in a particular relationship. He can be overbearing, or he can be very, very submissive. And it's conjunct his sun too. And I'm suspecting for him, this may be where some of his sexuality was expressing itself as homosexual. I am not saying that Venus conjunct Pluto makes you gay. So I just want to point that out now, but I'm saying in his case, it may have been part of what ended up for him. His sun is also quincunx Uranus. He may have had trouble expressing how unique he was. His sun is, his Mercury is also quincunx Jupiter. So he still managed to expand his thoughts, but it seemed to me he kind of was a bit of a social misfit. He didn't seem to understand things particularly well in terms of social interactions. I'm not an expert on who he was. Mars is trining, widely trining his Jupiter. So, and it's on his, Jupiter's in Sag on his descendant. So openness in relationships is there. Unfortunately, and this, I wonder sometimes if maybe he had a touch of Asperger's or something, which we didn't identify back then. He, shortly before he died, he met up with a young man. Turing was in his 40s. He met a 19-year-old boy. They went home together and proceeded to beginning to have a relationship. Shortly after he met this guy, his apartment was broken into and a lot of stuff was stolen in London. And the new boy, the 19-year-old boy, said, "Oh, I think some of my friends might have been involved in this." And so Alan goes to the police and says, "My apartment has been broken into." All well and good. And the English police asked him, I don't know why they would have asked him this. They said, "Are you a homosexual?" And Alan said, "Why, yes, I am." And they arrested him because it's illegal. It was illegal in 1954 or 53 to be gay in England. And he pled guilty to trial, and he was found dead a couple of months later. Some people feel it was suicide. It's really not sure. He was found dead of cyanide poisoning. There was a half-eaten apple next to him that nobody did any lab testing on. And the reason I mention that is because it is mentioned in some things written about him that his friends said that he was very taken with the Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs when the witch has got the poison apple and she's holding it out. So people wonder, did he poison his own apple and that was the way he was committed suicide, or did somebody poison him? Remember, he just was responsible for some people getting arrested for breaking into his apartment. So it's uncertain, but nevertheless, he is disgraced at this point, and he dies kind of persona non grata because he's gay, and no gay people could possibly be worth keeping as heroes of any kind, even if you did invent computers, invent the basics for computers. So meanwhile, let's go zooming ahead. In 2009, petitions are drawn up and people are signing them all over England saying, we want him pardoned. We want him set free from this nonsense. Pluto is in early Capricorn, which means it's directly opposite his sun and his Pluto. I picked August 15th because I believe the petition was first making its rounds in August of 2009. So I just picked the middle of the month. But so you've got this outside Plutonian force coming in and wanting to give him rebirth, restore his particular status, help him evolve into a more acceptable person. Uranus is opposite Saturn at this point. Yes, it is a little wide. But Uranus from late Pisces is beginning to squaring his Venus, and the Saturn is, just give me a second here, folks. I will get it together. Oh, Saturn's in Virgo, and it's trining his Saturn along with Mercury at that time. And up top we have Jupiter and Chiron and Mars, all in opposition to his Mars in Leo, which Mars can be how we express our sexuality physically. So it's kind of interesting that from the other side, outside, people are trying to Neptune and Chiron heal and Jupiter expand and accept his individual sexuality. But it doesn't get anywhere. It doesn't quite get anywhere, because even though Jupiter is kind of the kind of past opposite in its Mars, Jupiter and this Neptune and Chiron are in his 10th house. They're not really aspecting anything that strongly. Neither is Uranus really aspecting anything that strongly, except for the Pluto opposition. So people made a big cry about, hey, this isn't right, and we want to rehab him, but it doesn't quite take steam. People come out in opposition to approving of him. Pluto opposite his Pluto and Sun. But what happens is the Queen gets involved, and she decides on December 24th, because she's a queen in 2013, she pardons him. The hell with waiting for a petition. The Queen comes in and ta-da, you're no longer a blot on society. And here it's interesting. Pluto, the Sun, and the day, it's on December 24th. We have that date. Sun is almost exactly opposite his Mercury at this point, and a little earlier, it's between the middle of his Sun. Mercury is opposite his Pluto, so you're getting this opposite sort of sunlight blessing. Pluto at this point is 11 degrees, so it's a little past opposing anything in the Cancerian thing. But Venus, on the day of his rehabilitation as a gay person, pardon my cynicism, Venus that day is opposite his Neptune. Am I right? Yes. It's opposite his Neptune, and it's also almost on his midheaven and Uranus. So it's bringing a kind of blessing in terms of interpersonal relationship to his public image. And meanwhile, Chiron, he's having a Chiron return, and his image is healed. So he's back to being an acceptable human being, even though he does happen to be gay. So far, so good for Alan Turing. And the next person we're going to get into is going to take a little more extra time. And you may know a little bit about Vincent Van Gogh. Sorry about the strange typography. It was fine when I started out. And then when I moved it into PowerPoint, the white outlines got weird. Vincent Van Gogh, 1853 to 1890. I know we all know something about Vincent Van Gogh, but I want to mention a few things. He was only 37 when he died. And he only sold 2 paintings in his lifetime. He did not start doing art until he was 27, the last 10 years of his life. He did not start doing the paintings he was famous for until maybe the last 5 years of his life, and he produced hundreds of them. So this alone is a remarkable situation. In 5 years, he produced enough paintings to change the face of the world of art, provided, of course, they knew anything about him, which they didn't at that time. Some people did. He hung out with Toulouse-Lautrec and Gauguin and people. He was known in the community, but nobody knew in the art world who he was in terms of buying his paintings and getting him to be well known. Other things to mention, his brother Theo was very close to him. They were very intimate. Theo was the one actually making money, and so in many ways, Theo was the one that kept Vincent inside in an apartment and well-fed by sending him money continually. Theo was, I believe, an art dealer, or at least involved in the art world, and recognized his brother's talents and skills. In the beginning of his life, he actually, before he turned 27, he tried to be a minister and tried to counsel people. It didn't quite work out. He had problems with his father, who was also a minister, and they did not agree. Excuse me. They did not agree on what he believed in. So his natal chart. This is good data. It's pretty accurate from everything I've read. I think Lois Rodden gives it a AA. So this is an accurate chart. And right off the bat, look at all those aspects and clusters of planets. This is an obsessed person. When you see stuff bunched up like this, you have somebody who is driven one way or the other. And his Venus and his Mars are conjunct in Pisces, which certainly gives you a very aggressive empathy. I can see why he wanted to be a counselor, an advisor of some kind. But Mars, his sun is in Aries, and the rulership of his sun is conjunct the midheaven. His aggressiveness, his career, his forcefulness in everything he did. He was a driven man. And if you look the square, his Venus and Mars are squaring his Jupiter, and in a wider angle, his moon. So there's kind of this emotional turmoil going on while he's taking artistic, empathetic action. Jupiter conjunct the moon also makes him very emotional. Even if it's in Sag, it boosts up the emotions. He is a passionate, driven man. And if you look over at the other bundle and the Pluto and Mercury and Uranus are all conjunct. Uranus conjunct Pluto does not happen very often. The most recent time it happened was in the 60s, and Uranus conjunct Pluto then gave us the 1960s, the hippies, the freedom, all the changes and everything. It was in Virgo when all the rules went out the window. So there's this quality. He has to be a groundbreaker, an unusual person, a very difficult person, but it's all trining very compatibly with this incredibly emotional side that he has. Mars on his midheaven, yeah, that's right. He had problems with his dad. He fought with his dad over their spirituality and their way of approaching religion, which is in Pisces. But his Neptune's in Pisces in the 9th house. So he's got this vision. He's got this not in the physical world kind of a quality about him. And he's an Aries. He does what he wants to do. I often joke, you know, it's not that Aries aren't really selfish, because they'd have to be aware that other people existed. And it's a little flippant on my part, but there is some truth to it. Aries will do what they want to do regardless of what people will say to them. And Vincent was that kind of a person. And he struggled very much to find where he fit into the world. So the first chart of his after his death, let me briefly talk about his death, because that comes up later on. He was shot in the chest, and he died 2 days later. He was out in the wheat fields. He was shot in the chest out there, and he came back in, but it hadn't hit anything fatal. But there was no surgeon to take the bullet out, so an infection developed. His brother Theo showed up in time to watch Van Gogh die 2 days later of infection. And again, we have this question of if it's a suicide or not. But he died. His last words were, "The sadness never ends." And then he died. And so I just wanted to mention that before we go to the first post-death chart for Vincent. I do want to mention, by the way, I could do 100 charts for Vincent after his death. There's so many things that happen. I've just tried to pull up a few that kind of stand out to make a point about, as Elizabeth Grace says, the horoscope lives on, and astrology for the dead. So what this is, he dies, and within a year, his brother dies. His brother had been ill, but it's interesting that they were so close, and then he dies shortly thereafter. What's interesting about this chart is Saturn is in his house of siblings, down at the bottom by transit, and it's trining his natal Saturn. So on one level, Saturn in the house of siblings suggests the loss of a sibling, and yet it's a trine, and I wonder if it's both a loss and, I don't know what you believe about the afterlife, but maybe a reunion too. So it's a trine, and maybe it's somewhat positive. However, we're also seeing at this point Mars by transit on the day his brother died, January 25th, 1891. Mars is on his Venus. So an aggressive quality to one-to-one relationships, siblings and one-to-one. Mars is also opposite. No, it's not opposite anything. Sorry, never mind that. Okay. So that's interesting in and of itself. His brother dies, and and Venus is over on transiting is on his moon at this point. But and Mars is on his Venus. So something's going on in interpersonal relationships. But he's not famous yet. What is going on, though, is that Van Gogh was a profuse letter writer. He wrote constantly to his brother, his emotional state. He would send drawings. He would talk about his attitude towards art, what he thought art was supposed to mean. Vincent was completely and utterly involved in this vision of what is art, what does it mean, what is it supposed to mean. And his brother, Theo's wife, saved all the letters, and she actually put them together and published a book shortly after his death. But that came a little bit later. What happened directly after his death is somehow on July 29th, 1892, there's a museum show of Vincent's work. Surprise, surprise. He's not gone 2 years and suddenly he's becoming, getting the press that he needs, so to speak. So the first thing right up top, Jupiter is right on his Mercury. It's expanding the knowledge, his speaking. On the bottom, we have Uranus, directly opposite his transiting his Pluto, and also kind of edging towards his own Uranus, his Uranus opposition. Remember, he died at 37, so he didn't even get to his Uranus opposition, but it's coming up. And it seems to be stimulating stuff in terms of his public acceptance and his public career. I don't have, as I said, I could have done 20 charts for him. I did not do the chart for the book his sister-in-law published. It also helped his passion. And the next thing I'm tuning into is a book that was written about him as a novel by Irving Stone. Lust for Life came out in 1934. It was a novelization of his life. A lot of it was taken from the letters that his sister-in-law published about Theo and him. If you read nothing about Van Gogh, by the way, the published letters are a real eye-opener in terms of Van Gogh's personality. Some people think he may have been mad. I don't know. Mental illness, I don't know. I can't really say one way or the other. But this book comes out in 1934. I picked the middle of the year. I don't have a publication date. Uranus is on his Pluto. So it went from opposite his Pluto back when he had his first museum show after his death to being on his Pluto when the book comes out, a fictionalized version or a novelization of his life. And that's the thing that really kind of stands out the most in this chart. Saturn is in late Aquarius. It's kind of trining his, it's a little past trining his north node. Let me just look. That's kind of the strongest thing going on in his chart at this point. Jupiter earlier in the year had been opposite his sun, which certainly could have suggested an expansion of who he is out into the world. And then in 1956, Lust for Life is made into a movie starring Kirk Douglas. The movie is criticized a bit. It's a bit romanticized. And I'm sure Kirk Douglas was a lot more Kirk Douglas than Vincent Van Gogh. He's a great actor. I'm not knocking him, but it was 1956, and movie biographies were not exactly the most accurate things going on at all the time. However, Uranus is now in very early Leo, late Cancer, so it's actually trining, Uranus by transit is trining his midheaven, his Mars, and his Venus, the stuff that really kind of propelled him forward as an emotional and committed and empathetic painter. And I have Pluto circled for, and Uranus is squaring. Uranus is squaring his Pluto and his Uranus, which is bringing up some hoopla at the same time. Excuse me, I have a cat sniffing in the background, sneezing in the background. I hope you don't hear that. So there's not a lot going on at this point, but still his legacy is being kind of squeaked and pushed. The next thing I have is a documentary from, sorry, got to go back a bit. A documentary from 1988 called, I believe, just Vincent. and it's a fairly accurate biography, a documentary biography, excuse me. And it was released, the first thing I noted, that it was reviewed in the New York Times on the 16th of March, 1988. And I figured that's as good a place as any, because the movie reviews usually came out the day after a movie opened. So we have the sun is on his Venus, Jupiter is on his Pluto. The sun is the transiting north node is up in by his midheaven in the 10th house of career. This is a movie that sets the record kind of straight. It's not as romanticized as Lust for Life with Kirk Douglas. Chiron by transit is on his north node in terms of his life path. So it's kind of healing his life path in some way in the way we present it to the world. Mars and Neptune are kind of straddling his natal Chiron, bringing a spiritual healing going on at that point. And Saturn is at early Capricorn. Early Capricorn, and it's just give me a second here. Oh, it's trining his Pluto, and it's trining Saturn and Uranus are trining his Pluto and trining his Uranus. So again, blessings to set the record straight, Saturn, and bring him the notice of the original kind of person he is. And Pluto is at 10, 11, 12 degrees Scorpio, which means it's right about middle between his Uranus and his Saturn up on the top. So again, he's getting kind of a rebirth and transformation of who he is and how he is known. There are many other charts I could do for him when the book is published, the major shows he's had, other books that were published, other movies, but we want to try to keep this down to an hour. And I'm really here to kind of whet your interest. This is not the most scholarly thing I could have done, but that's why I pointed you in the direction of Elizabeth Grace, because she's more scholarly than I am. And at the last minute, I came up with, I was getting all this stuff ready, and something happened in the life or the death of, I'm sorry, I'm jumping ahead here. I forgot this. My apologies. 2011. What happens in 2011? A book comes out saying he didn't commit suicide. What they believe happened is that he was hanging out in the wheat field with a couple of kids from the neighborhood. I say kids, but they were older, much older, like maybe teenagers or something. One of them was very fond of dressing like a cowboy, even in 1888, 86, I think, when he died. I'm sorry, I don't have it in front of me. They were cowboys, and he had a gun. And the question is, were they goofing around and accidentally shot Van Gogh? Nobody really knows. People have pointed out that he said he was in the field painting. There was no canvas and no field anywhere, any paints or canvas in the field when they went back and searched the next day. On top of it, the gun wasn't found right away either. It was found. So now he did on his deathbed say, it's nobody's fault. I was meant to die. But, we're already talking about a depressive person who probably may have even seen death as a wonderful opportunity to get the hell out of here where he was so unhappy. But he's also known to have written quite frequently about suicide as a horrible thing and nobody should do it. So the question becomes, did he commit suicide or not? So we're getting this book coming out in 2011, over 120 years roughly after he died. Uranus is at 5 degrees Aries. I picked July 1st. I'm not sure exactly when the book came out, but it came out in 2001. So Uranus is dancing across his Venus and his Sun in 2011, in his 10th house of career. So suddenly there are surprises about his personal, his public image. And from the other side, Saturn down at the bottom is at 11 degrees Libra, which is just about opposite his Sun. So there's kind of this retelling, an attempt to correct facts, whether they're being corrected or not, we're not really sure, because Uranus is just sort of springing things all over the place. Pluto at that point in 2011 is at 6 degrees Capricorn, meaning it's trining his natal Uranus. So again, transformative surprises that are giving yet another rebirth to Vincent Van Gogh's image and reputation and quality, and also for that matter, Neptune and Chiron are kind of sextiling the early Pluto stuff. Neptune is sextiling his natal Pluto, Chiron is sextiling his natal Uranus. So again, healing and spirituality is being brought in too. So once again, we're seeing Vincent Van Gogh getting reborn once again with new information as to whether or not he actually committed suicide. Now back to what I was originally talking about. When I was getting ready for this, I discovered something kind of amusing. Well, it's not really amusing, but it tied into this topic. Mahatma Gandhi, or Mohandas Gandhi, I don't know exactly what the proper term is for him, was born 150 years ago on October 2nd. Gandhi, 1869 to 1948. And here is his natal chart. Clearly, again, somewhat obsessive. Look at that that T-square. The moon is squaring Jupiter and Pluto, and it's squaring Venus and Mars. Jupiter and Pluto conjunct are always suggestive of social work, an attempt to heal the world, fix the world, make the world a better place. It's part of a T-square squaring his moon and opposing his Mars in Scorpio and his Venus in Scorpio, which is an intense personal relationships. Uranus is conjunct his midheaven, so he's a disruptor. His career is as a disruptor, and he was. What's interesting is Saturn is trining Neptune. Like Saturn trining Uranus, Saturn really kind of helps rein in Neptune. What we have whenever anybody has Saturn trine Neptune in their charts, this is someone who can take dreams and make them concrete. They can take the idealism and mythology and fantasy and everything excuse me, of Neptune's, and Saturn makes them concrete. So he became the father of modern India. And what's interesting is Saturn, his skills are in Saturn, in his house of skills and abilities. And he was the one, as far as I know, one of the first people to really identify peaceful resistance, nonviolent resistance, which Martin Luther King certainly grabbed onto. And Gandhi was very much, they blocked the trains. They would not do violent protests. They would only do positive, passive protests. And Uranus, by the way, is also trining his Mars, suggesting unusual activity and unusual ways to act, ways of acting that are not expected. And so he became the father of modern India. And look, there are hundreds of charts I could do from Gandhi because he was assassinated. There's lots of stories floating around, kind of crazy stuff come up about him. And I could do a whole hour on Gandhi. But the reason I include him in this one as the last chart is it turns out that on his 150th birthday, somebody defiled his grave. Okay, they stole his ashes, and somebody in green paint wrote "traitor" across his monument or memorial there. Now, most of his ashes were scattered when he died. There's one in different parts of India, I guess, to distribute Gandhi across his country, so to speak. But a small amount were saved and kept in this memorial. And Uranus is opposite his Mercury. It is also, what else is going on here? Let me just check my notes. Okay, Pluto is opposite his Uranus. Let's go down to Pluto at the bottom. Pluto is opposite his Uranus on the midheaven. So there's some deep Pluto at the bottom, just bringing something up in opposition to his uniqueness. Uranus, as I said, is opposite Mercury, which is certainly going to kick off. This is the day it happened. It's his birthday. His sun is on his sun. And those are the things that stand out there. Clearly, somebody is attempting to disrupt his legacy, disrupt his particular fame. And just for the heck of it, I just did a solar return for the same day because I figured, what the heck, this should show up in his solar return for his 150th year. And yeah, it sure does. Start with the ruler of the ascendant in his solar return is Uranus, and it is opposite, a little bit wide, but it's opposite Mercury. So once again, Mercury is getting dragged in there. The news item about him. But when you go to the midheaven is in Scorpio. You go to the ruler of that. Pluto is hanging out with with Saturn. So there's, but it's in Capricorn. So my personal belief is I don't think this particular scandal will really stick very much. I just think it's an interesting blot on his post-death career, and it's interesting that on his birthday, almost as a present to me for this presentation, here we have it. There's other stuff going on here too. If you look at the north node of his solar return is in Cancer, ruled by the moon. It's at 29 degrees. The moon is void of course. So this is one of the reasons I'm saying I don't think this event will have much emotional resonance if the moon is void of course in his solar return. So, and the belief is, by the way, that the word traitor was written on the tombstone because they suspect it might have been Hindu protesters. Gandhi was always a big fan of getting Hindus and Muslims to cooperate with each other and get along, but they didn't. So they're still arguing to this day, and that's what's going on. Two more quick things I want to mention before we open up to questions. Okay, excuse me, my cat is attacking me again. One thing I'm curious about, and this is another thing worth examining, although I haven't done it yet, is what about people who are incredibly famous and then fade away to nothing? I had talked about this with Elizabeth Grace on my radio show. I used Philip Wylie as an example, a noted author of the 30s and 40s and 50s, extremely well-known for publishing A Generation of Vipers, a social criticism that became very popular at the time in the 40s. He wrote a novel in the 30s called The Gladiator, which was actually about a super-powered kind of a person or somebody who had incredible abilities, which directly inspired Siegel and Schuster to create Superman. He wrote the novel When Worlds Collide that became a movie in the 1950s. And he also, among many other books, wrote a fascinating book called The Disappearance, where the premise of the book is that in the first half of the book, all the women disappear and off from Earth. And in the second half of the book, all the men disappear. And what happens to society as they are divided by sex, and only women exist and only men exist. Needless to say, the women create a utopia and move the world forward, and the men create a mess. As a matter of fact, in 1951, when the book was published, he invented the idea of sex dolls, which now are becoming more popular. But what else were men going to do with no women? They couldn't actually make the world a better place. They had to find some way. Anyway, my cynicism is getting out of hand. However, by the time, I know this author because my father had a lot of his books, but by 2000, the year 2000, all of his books are out of print, and nobody talks about Philip Wylie. They just put one of his books back into print, Generation of Vipers, in 2005. But part of me is like, what happened? So that's something worth examining. And the other thing, which I'll very briefly touch on, yeah, we're talking about famous people here. Elizabeth Grace, when I was talking to her, made the point that this does happen to regular folks too, just us regular peons here. And I know in my discussion with her, she discussed how a father's chart, even though the father had died, transits to the father's chart, who was dead, impacted on the son. I'm not going to get this S-O-N, his son. I'm not going to get into those details now, but I want to leave them dangling for anybody that wants to take it further and discuss it further. So I'm open for questions. And while I'm taking questions, I just want to remind everybody where I was inspired from. Elizabeth Grace, a wonderful astrologer. So does anybody have any questions? Maybe I can answer them. While I'm waiting, what the heck? There's my commercial. There's a more modern picture.
I have a question.
Oh, great. Oh, Elizabeth, how you doing?
I'm doing great. This was so much fun to look at all of your cool research. And I love the fact that you're calling this astrology for the dead. That's much more provocative than the horoscope lives forever. I really like it. It's great.
Thank you.
So I have a question, because this is something that I noticed when I was looking at these horoscopes of dead people, when the ones that I'm drawn to. What kind of synastry did you notice between the people that you're writing about and your own horoscope?
Well, I have to speak very generically here, but I will say that Van Gogh is an artist, and I'm very much into art. I'm into poetry, Emily Dickinson, And Vivian Mayer is a photographer, so I'm automatically drawn to art stories.
But how do their horoscopes engage with your horoscopes? I'm wondering if you noticed any synastry.
Okay, you know what? What the heck? Let me go back, whiz through all these.
Yeah.
Zoom, okay. Emily Dickinson. My Neptune is at 26 degrees Libra. Her moon is at 23 degrees Libra.
Isn't that interesting?
Yep. I don't have a lot of Sag, but I do. Well, I have a stellium in Sag from 20 to 24 degrees Sag, where her Jupiter and Neptune are. Okay. So
well, 20. Wait, you have 20 to 20. No, 20 to 24 Sag. Did you say?
20 to 24 Capricorn is
Capricorn,
which is right on top of her Venus and her. I'm getting that dizzy here. Right on top of her Jupiter and her Neptune in Capricorn. So I've got a combination. My Neptune's on her moon, and my Sun, Moon, Mercury, North Node, Midheaven, and Chiron are all on top of her.
Isn't that fascinating?
And let's see, Vivian, old girl, how you doing here? My Saturn is in Scorpio, just like hers is.
Yeah.
And my Pluto conjuncts her Neptune. It's a little wide, but my Uranus conjuncts her Pluto. And
we don't have a birth time for her, so we don't really, you can't really tell if there's a personal connection between, her ascendant and some of your planets.
Yeah. But I can say that if the moon is even relatively close to where it is, 23 degrees Virgo, even 5 degrees either direction, it's trining into both my moon and my Capricorn bundle. I have a moon in Taurus myself. So there is a connection there too. Let's
and her Mars is a 24 Sag and Uranus, so that would activate your chart.
Yes, it would.
Interesting.
And pop down to Alan Turing. Actually, I don't. Funny thing, this is the one I was least connected to, but I was fascinated by it.
Huh.
So the only thing I can say is my moon is conjunct his Saturn. I have a moon at 29 Taurus. But I'm looking around the rest, and there isn't a lot to connect me. His moon is in Libra, so it's in the same sign as my Neptune. His Neptune is conjunct my Uranus, and part of my T-square with Capricorn. There's some things, but not as strong, and it's a funny thing, I did not feel as strong a connection, although I was fascinated by the fact that the petition came up, 50 to 75 years after he died to make him acceptable again.
Yeah.
And to me, Vincent Van Gogh, oh, well, it's all the Taurus. I have Taurus rising with a Taurus moon. So he's got all that Taurus, Pluto and Uranus and Saturn. And that's really my strongest connection to him.
And then again, the Sagittarius, and then we see that, again, 2024 mutable is activated. So you've been drawn to a lot of people that have 20 to 24 mutable prominent in their horoscope.
And finally, Gandhi, I just thought it was funny that that it turned up as I'm doing this research that they defile his tomb. But my Uranus and his Uranus.
But look at his ascendant at 25 degrees. Oh no, sorry, that Libra.
That goes right into my Neptune.
Yeah.
My Uranus is at 20 degrees Cancer. So I have the exact same Uranus as him. My Mars is in Scorpio. And so is my Saturn. He's got stuff in Scorpio there too. And his other stuff is in Taurus where I have my moon. So yeah, there is a connection here, although I originally just latched onto it because I just thought, I'm almost finished my research and this news item pops up and I'm like, this is the cherry on the cake, that 150 years later they defile his tomb. So,
yeah.
Not that I'm knocking, I don't think his tomb should have been defiled, just astrologically, it was kind of really perfect timing. So yeah, there is a connection that I'm drawn to too when I'm looking up these people's charts. You're absolutely right. Didn't I not tell you, everybody, that she's a great astrologer? Okay.
Yes. Great to meet you, Elizabeth.
Nice to meet you too.
I just want a quick comment. I guess you could look at your Uranus, which is at 20 degrees Cancer, in all of the charts, because that rules astrology.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Yeah, very much so. It's right in my nadir. It's the core of who I am. My Uranus in Cancer at 20 degrees, which Pluto is in opposition right now. I'm having trouble. Anyway.
So do we have any more questions or comments?
Quite fascinating.
Okay.
Very fascinating.
Yeah, the chart keeps working long after you're dead. And just a side mention, Gandhi's chart was rectified, and the guy's from India, so you know damn well they've rectified the hell out of his chart. So I'm pretty sure that's an accurate birth time, by the way.
Well, you did a wonderful job taking us through all those aspects. Thank you so much from all of us. And
I thank you, and Eddie thanks you.
Thank you, Eddie. Thank you, Elizabeth. And would you all please thank Anthony Picco, everyone? We'll catch you next time.
Oh, you're very, very, very welcome. I enjoy the hell out of these things. So
thank you, Anthony. That was awesome.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I know. And by the way, she's going to be in my show later this month, later in November. So if you tune into my Spreaker.com show, we'll be interviewing Elizabeth later in November.
Okay,
so,
fantastic. Okay, bye everyone. Thank you.
Bye.